Everyone wants to lead. They want respect when they speak, silence when they enter a room, authority that doesn't need to shout. But very few men ever pause long enough to ask the most important question of all. Not how to lead others, but whether they are capable of leading themselves. Because leadership doesn't begin in public. It begins in private. It begins in the moments no one applauds, no one records, no one notices. It begins when frustration rises and you choose restraint. When ego demands attention and you choose silence. When emotion pushes forward and you decide to step back. Most men skip this part. They want influence before discipline, recognition before responsibility, power before control. And that is why so many who rise quickly fall just as fast. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood something modern culture keeps ignoring. If you cannot command your own mind, then authority will not make you stronger. It will make you dangerous. Think about it. A man who cannot control his anger does not become calmer with power. He becomes more destructive. A man who cannot master his desires does not become fulfilled with influence. He becomes enslaved by it. A man who cannot sit alone with his thoughts will not suddenly become wise when others start listening. Yet today, everyone is in a hurry to lead. Lead teams, lead families, lead movements, lead online. Very few are willing to do the quiet, uncomfortable work that leadership actually requires. The work of self-mastery. The work of governing impulses, of observing emotions without obeying them, of responding instead of reacting. Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men in history, an emperor, a commander, a ruler of millions. Yet his private writings were not about conquering others. They were reminders to himself. Control your temper. Do not be ruled by pleasure. Do not let praise inflate you or insult shrink you. Do not become what you despise. That alone should stop you. The most powerful man in the world did not trust himself without discipline. So ask yourself honestly, why should you? If leadership were about titles, every loud man would be a leader. If leadership were about confidence alone, every arrogant voice would deserve respect. But we know that's not true. We've all seen men with authority who crumble under pressure, men who speak about strength but cannot tolerate disagreement, men who demand loyalty yet betray their own values the moment it's inconvenient. They didn't fail because they lacked ambition. They failed because they never mastered themselves. The Stoics warned us about this. They taught that the mind, left undisciplined, will chase comfort over character. That emotion, unchecked, will disguise itself as truth. That ego, when unexamined, will sabotage everything you try to build. And here's the uncomfortable part. You don't lose leadership in one dramatic moment. You lose it slowly, in small reactions, in unnecessary arguments, in moments where you say too much, where you act too fast, where you choose relief instead of restraint. Every time you let emotion drive the wheel, you weaken your authority. Every time you avoid responsibility for your inner state, you surrender control.
This is why the Stoics believed that self-mastery is not optional. It is the foundation. Before you can guide others through chaos, you must prove you can stand calmly within it. Before you can demand discipline, you must embody it. Before you can expect respect, you must become someone who does not need it to feel whole. Leadership is not about being followed. It's about being steady when others are not. It's about clarity when others are confused. It's about restraint when others give in. And that level of strength is invisible to most people because it happens internally. No applause, no validation, no shortcuts, just a man, his thoughts, and the choice to govern them. That is why so many avoid it. It's easier to control others than to confront yourself. It's easier to demand silence than to cultivate wisdom. It's easier to chase status than to build character. But the Stoics didn't teach what was easy. They taught what was necessary. They taught that a man who conquers himself is already powerful, that a man who can remain calm under pressure cannot be manipulated, that a man who knows his values cannot be shaken by praise or criticism. This channel is not about hype. It's not about noise. It's not about pretending to be strong. It's about building the kind of inner authority that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind of calm that makes people listen without you raising your voice, the kind of discipline that makes leadership inevitable, not forced. If you're here because you're tired of reacting, tired of being pulled by emotion, tired of feeling capable but inconsistent, then you're in the right place. Subscribe, not for motivation that fades, not for empty quotes, but for the daily reminder that real power begins within. Because before you try to lead others, before you seek influence, respect, or authority, you must first master yourself. The Stoics never separated philosophy from life. For them, wisdom was not something you discussed, it was something you practiced, especially when it was difficult. Marcus Aurelius did not study Stoicism in peace. He studied it while ruling an empire under constant pressure, war at the borders, plague in the cities, betrayal within his own circle. And yet, when you read his private notes, you don't find complaints, you don't find excuses, you find discipline. Reminders to himself to stay rational when insulted, to stay just when angry, to stay humble when praised. That alone tells you something important. Stoicism was never meant to make life comfortable. It was meant to make you stronger. Seneca warned that the man who tries to command others before he commands himself is building on unstable ground, because the mind, when untrained, does not obey reason, it obeys impulse. And impulse does not care about your values, it cares about relief. This is why Stoicism begins with attention, not attention to the world, but attention to the self. What triggers you, what pulls you off balance, what makes you react instead of respond. Epictetus, who began life as a slave, understood this better than most. He taught that no one can truly harm you unless you surrender control of your inner state. Chains can bind the body, circumstances can limit movement, but the mind, if disciplined, remains free. This idea is uncomfortable for many men today because it removes the excuse to blame circumstances. If your anger controls you, that is not the fault of others. If your focus collapses under pressure, that is not the fault of stress. If your character bends when challenged, that is not the fault of the world. Stoicism places responsibility where it belongs, with you. That is why it works. The Stoics believed that leadership without inner order inevitably leads to chaos, because disorder within spills outward. A man who cannot tolerate frustration will create tension wherever he goes. A man who cannot restrain desire will sacrifice long-term respect for short-term pleasure. A man who cannot accept criticism will silence truth to protect his ego. These patterns repeat across history. Empires fall not from external enemies, but from leaders who lost command of themselves. Families fracture not because of lack of love, but because of uncontrolled emotion. Careers collapse not because of incompetence, but because character was never fortified. The Stoics studied this carefully. They observed that the mind, left unchecked, creates suffering even in favorable conditions, that wealth does not calm an anxious man, that power does not steady an undisciplined one, that recognition does not fulfill someone who lacks inner direction, which is why Stoicism emphasizes preparation, training the mind before crisis arrives, practicing restraint before temptation appears, clarifying values before pressure tests them. This is what separates Stoicism from motivation. Motivation excites you for a moment. Stoicism restructures you for a lifetime. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you should wake each day expecting ignorance, ingratitude, hostility, and selfishness, not to become bitter, but to become prepared, because when you expect resistance, you are not shocked by it.
When you anticipate difficulty, you are not destabilized by it. This mental readiness is leadership at its core, not reacting emotionally to what was predictable, not being surprised by human nature, not letting external behavior dictate your internal state. The Stoics did not aim to control others. They aimed to be ungovernable from within. That is a different kind of power. A man who is not enslaved by praise cannot be manipulated. A man who is not afraid of discomfort cannot be threatened. A man who does not need validation cannot be controlled. This is why Stoic leadership feels quiet. There is no desperation in it, no urgency to dominate, no need to prove worth. It stands firm because it is rooted internally. And this is where modern men struggle. We are surrounded by noise, opinions, provocation, endless stimulation. Every platform invites reaction. Every conflict invites outrage. Every challenge invites ego. Stoicism offers a counterweight. Pause. Observe. Choose. Not because you are passive, but because you are deliberate. Leadership, in the Stoic sense, is not about commanding attention. It is about commanding yourself in moments where most men lose control. When insulted, when tempted, when pressured, when tired. That is when character speaks. That is when the mind reveals whether it has been trained or neglected. The Stoics believed that if you win this internal struggle consistently, external leadership becomes a byproduct. People follow steadiness. They trust clarity. They respect restraint. Not because it is loud, but because it is rare. And rarity carries weight. This is not theory. This is discipline applied daily. And it begins with the decision to treat self-mastery not as an abstract ideal, but as a non-negotiable practice.
Self-mastery is not a personality trait. It is not something you are born with. It is something you practice, daily, deliberately, and often quietly. This is where most men misunderstand Stoicism. They think it is about suppressing emotion, about becoming cold, detached, unfeeling. But the Stoics never taught denial. They taught discipline. Emotion is information. Impulse is energy. Desire is directionless force. Without mastery, these things run wild. With mastery, they become tools. A disciplined mind does not eliminate emotion. It places it in its proper role. Anger becomes a signal, not a command. Fear becomes a warning, not a prison. Pleasure becomes an experience, not a master. This distinction matters, because a man who believes his emotions are his identity will always be ruled by them. And a man ruled by emotion cannot lead, not himself, and certainly not others. Leadership demands clarity under pressure, and pressure reveals what you practice. When everything is calm, self-control looks easy. When you are respected, discipline feels natural. When outcomes are favorable, patience comes without effort. But pressure strips away illusion. When you are insulted publicly, when plans collapse, when authority is challenged, when expectations rise and resources fall, that is when self-mastery is tested. And most men fail not because they are weak, but because they are untrained. They react too quickly. They speak too soon. They defend ego instead of truth. They choose relief instead of restraint. The Stoics warned about this pattern. They understood that reaction feels powerful in the moment, but costly in the long term. Reaction gives the illusion of control while quietly surrendering it. Because the moment you react, someone else is steering your behavior. A comment controls your mood. A challenge controls your tone. An inconvenience controls your patience. That is not leadership. That is dependency. Self-mastery begins when you reclaim that space between stimulus and response, that small pause, that moment where you decide whether emotion will speak or whether reason will. This pause is invisible to others, but it is where authority is born. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that nothing external has the power to disturb the mind unless the mind agrees to be disturbed. That agreement happens silently. You choose it, and because it is chosen, it can be unchosen. This is the core Stoic insight. You are not responsible for what appears in your mind, but you are responsible for what you entertain, reinforce, and obey. Most men never question this. They assume their thoughts are facts, their emotions are commands, their impulses are truth. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Thoughts are impressions, emotions are responses, impulses are suggestions. You decide what becomes action, and action, repeated, becomes character. Character is what people actually follow, not charisma, not intensity, not dominance. Consistency. The man who remains steady when outcomes are uncertain. The man who remains respectful when challenged. The man who remains composed when things go wrong. This steadiness signals something rare: self-trust. And self-trust is magnetic, because if you trust yourself, others feel it. They feel the absence of desperation. They feel the absence of volatility. They feel the presence of direction. This is why Stoic leadership does not beg for attention. It attracts it. The man who has mastered himself does not need to prove strength. He demonstrates it in restraint. He does not assert authority through volume. He expresses it through calm. He does not dominate conversations. He listens, evaluates, and responds deliberately. This does not make him passive. It makes him precise. And precision is power. The Stoics believe that every situation offers two paths, one governed by impulse, one governed by principle. Impulse seeks comfort, validation, and immediate relief. Principle seeks alignment with values, even when it costs something. Self-mastery is the ability to choose principle consistently, not once, not when it's easy, but when it matters. When silence is harder than speaking, when patience is harder than force, when humility is harder than pride. This is why Stoicism is demanding. It removes excuses. You cannot blame temperament. You cannot blame circumstance. You cannot blame others for your inner disorder. If you lose control of yourself, that failure belongs to you, but so does the power to correct it. And this is the part that should give you confidence. Self-mastery is not reserved for exceptional men. It is available to any man willing to practice it. Daily reflection, deliberate restraint, honest self-examination, not self-criticism, self-assessment. Where did I react today? Where did I choose comfort over discipline? Where did emotion override judgment? These questions are not meant to shame you. They are meant to sharpen you. The Stoics believed that the unexamined life does not drift accidentally. It deteriorates deliberately, because what you ignore eventually controls you, but what you confront becomes manageable. This is the difference between leadership that lasts and authority that collapses. Men who build influence without self-mastery eventually sabotage themselves. Men who build self-mastery first can handle influence when it arrives. because leadership amplifies who you already are. It does not transform you. If you are reactive, leadership makes you volatile. If you are insecure, leadership makes you defensive. If you are disciplined, leadership makes you effective. This is why Stoicism insists on sequence. Master yourself first. Everything else follows. If any part of this feels uncomfortably familiar, that's not an accident. That quiet tension you feel when these ideas land, that recognition, is not weakness, it's awareness. Most men never reach this point. They scroll past it. They drown it out with noise. They tell themselves they'll deal with it later. But something in you paused, and that pause matters. Because real change never begins with certainty. It begins with discomfort, with the realization that something within you could be sharper, calmer, more disciplined. If this perspective is resonating, not as entertainment, but as truth, take a moment and give this video a like. Not for the algorithm, but because this message deserves to reach the men who are still reacting, still burning energy on things that do not deserve control over their minds. There are men right now making decisions from frustration instead of clarity. Men about to say something that will cost them respect. Men about to act on impulse and regret it quietly later. A simple gesture, one click, can place this reminder in front of someone before that moment arrives. And that matters. Because Stoicism was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to be passed on, not loudly, but deliberately. The ancient Stoics didn't write to impress crowds. They wrote to stabilize minds. They understood that wisdom spreads differently than noise. It doesn't shout, it settles. And if you're still here listening, it means you're not just consuming this, you're considering it. That alone puts you ahead of where you were. Because the goal is not perfection. The goal is progress with awareness. No Stoic ever claimed mastery overnight. Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself again and again because he knew the mind forgets. It drifts. It rationalizes. It takes shortcuts. This is why repetition matters, why reflection matters. Why returning to these ideas is not redundancy, it's reinforcement. And if you're finding value here, consider subscribing, not as a passive follower, but as a practitioner, someone who returns to these reminders not when life is calm, but when pressure builds. Because pressure is where these principles prove their worth. Subscribing is not about quantity, it's about consistency. The Stoics believed that character is shaped not by rare moments of intensity, but by small, repeated decisions. What you expose your mind to daily becomes the framework through which you interpret reality. Chaos in, chaos out. Clarity in, clarity out. This channel exists to provide that clarity, not by escaping reality, but by facing it with steadiness. And if you're listening closely, you may notice something else. There's no rush here, no urgency, no demand. Because Stoic discipline does not chase, it attracts. It stands firm and allows others to meet it where they are. If this way of thinking aligns with you, you already know what to do. Stay, return, practice. Because the men who lead themselves well do not need constant motivation. They need reminders. Reminders of what they already know, but are tempted to forget. And in the final part, we'll bring this together, not as theory, but as grounded practice. Simple, demanding, effective. The kind of application that turns philosophy into daily behavior. So now, the question is no longer what Stoicism teaches. The question is how you live it. Because philosophy that stays in the mind never changes behavior, and behavior is where leadership is revealed. Self-mastery begins with small, deliberate acts, not dramatic gestures. The Stoics knew this. They understood that discipline is built quietly, in moments most people overlook. Start here. First, practice the pause. Before you respond, before you send the message, before you speak in frustration, create space. Even a few seconds. That pause is not weakness, it is authority asserting itself. It is you deciding that emotion will not dictate your actions. Second, train awareness, not suppression. When anger appears, don't fight it. Observe it. Ask yourself, what judgment am I making right now? What expectation was violated? Emotion loses power when it is understood. The Stoics didn't say don't feel, they said don't be ruled. Third, define your principles before you are tested. Under pressure, you will not rise to ideals, you will fall to habits. Decide in advance what kind of man you are, how you handle disrespect, how you handle temptation, how you handle uncertainty. When the moment comes, you won't need to improvise, you'll execute. Fourth, end each day with honest reflection, not judgment, not excuses, just clarity. Where did I act with discipline today? Where did I react instead of respond? What will I do differently tomorrow? This is how the Stoics sharpened themselves, not by chasing perfection, but by refusing to drift unconsciously. And finally, detach from the need to be seen as a leader. This is the hardest part for most men. The need for recognition is often what undermines authority. True leadership emerges when you stop trying to prove it, when your actions are consistent, your temperament stable, your values visible without announcement. People follow what feels solid, and solidity comes from within. This is the quiet paradox the Stoics lived by. The man who masters himself does not need to demand respect. It finds him. Because self-mastery changes how you walk into a room. Your words carry weight because they are measured. Your presence calms because it is grounded. Your decisions are trusted because they are not reactive. This is not dominance, it is composure. And composure is the highest form of strength. Before you try to lead others, before you correct, command, or convince, return to yourself. Master the voice in your own head, the impulses in your own body, the judgments in your own mind. Everything else flows from that. Leadership is not built outward in, it is built inward out. And if you stay committed to this path, calm over chaos, discipline over impulse, clarity over noise, you will notice something change. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. You will speak less and be heard more, react less and trusted more, chase less and command more. That is Stoic leadership. Quiet, unshakable, earned. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this message gave you clarity, share it with someone who needs steadiness right now. Leave a comment with one insight you're taking with you, and subscribe so these reminders stay close when life tests you again. Stay grounded, stay unshaken, stay stoic.